So this is important. We're not talking about written language, we're talking about spoken language. If we're talking about the history and ontogeny, we're talking about spoken language. Now you say this is obvious, however, it turns out that if your intuitions about language and what's grammatical and what's not and all that, it turns out there's very good evidence that that comes from your literacy and your knowledge of written language, not from spoken language. So for example, in English, if you ask people to give you a canonical English sentence, a prototypical English sentence, they'll say something like, John kicked the ball. But it turns out sentences like that are vanishingly rare in spoken English discourse. You say things like, hey, you know my friend John? You set up the topic and you say, he kicked the ball. So it tends to have a pronoun in the subject position like 80% of the time in spoken discourse. In French, if you ask French people, you give them a sentence with a negative in it, and I'm not going to embarrass myself in any French, but without the ne, but with the pas, they say, no, that's not grammatical. But in spoken everyday French, you know that quite often the ne is gone and the pas is the only thing that's there. So your intuitions about it and your grammaticality judgments are often different than the reality. So you need spoken discourse and you need to look at what people actually do. And in language acquisition, luckily they're not literate and we don't need to worry about that. But we need to worry about our intuitions all the time, as opposed to looking at what people are doing. A second knot is not to think of meaning as a thing. Wittgenstein warned us about this many decades ago. But this is now the approach that I've been taking about linguistic communication, gestural communication. But think about the use of linguistic forms for communicative functions. And so we say, it's just like if I say, I use a knife to cut things, then I can say the function of the knife is to cut. So I can talk about, I use linguistic forms to do things, and then I say that the function of this linguistic form is to do X. Yeah, coward in the corner, please. Okay. And so we need to think about the use of linguistic forms for directing attention in some shared conceptual space, just like the gestures, the pointing, and the gestures that we've been talking about. Shared conceptual space, directing attention, we use linguistic forms to do that. If we think about meaning as a thing, then we've got this problem in acquisition of we have to connect a symbol with a meaning and associate the thing. But if we think about children understanding intentional actions, and then there's a special class of intentional actions that are intentional actions attempted to manipulate my mental state in a certain way, okay, that's what we're doing with language. So that's why you need to think of it as a process. Don't think of words as things and meanings as things, and we have to connect them. It's just like using a knife to cut things. I'm using linguistic symbols to do things, and when the child is learning that, they're learning what you do with these things. So how they use them and how I would use them in imitation of that, and so therefore what their function is. Okay, now here comes the hard part. Not grammatical rules, but patterns of use. Not grammatical rules, if we think about psychologically, we're talking about schemas. In cognitive science in general, psychology in general, schemas are a well-established psychological construct. So let's think about grammatical patterns of use as schemas. The same thing as schemas, sensory motor schemas, or other kinds of conceptual schemas. Right? And don't think of rules. I understand that grammatical rules in linguistics are not supposed to be prescriptive, but only descriptive, but I think the notion of rule carries with it all kinds of baggage that we do much better without. So the one word for schemas that Ron Laneker and Adele Goldberg have used is constructions. And constructions, we need to think of constructions as patterns of use, and constructions are themselves complex symbols. So this is an example taken from Adele Goldberg. She sneezed him the ball. Well, the word sneeze is an intransitive verb typically with only an actor. You typically don't have an object and much less an indirect object. But she sneezed him the ball is perfectly fine because the construction itself, the English ditransitive construction, he gave me the book, has a meaning by itself with no content. So I can say, the Gazer daxed the meek a duke or something, right? And it still has that meaning of transfer. So the grammatical pattern itself carries meaning. So constructions themselves are symbols. They're complex symbols with internal structure. They have sub-functions within them, but they are, so the classic way for structural linguistics through Chomsky has been meaningless rules and meaningful lexical items. And construction grammar rejects that cut and says it's not meaningless rules and meaningful lexical items, but everything is form and function. And you have small forms and functions like grammatical morphemes and words, and large forms and functions like whole grammatical constructions and their functions. So everything is form function, and the only issue is it a small or a large, is it simple or complex, and so forth. We do not have a grammar, and that's another thing that in formal linguistics has been, that the child is constructing a grammar, the child's grammar at this moment. It's a singular thing, this big monolithic grammar. But in the construction grammar and cognitive linguistics approach, we have an inventory of constructions. It's a structured inventory. I guess the best thinking at this point is that it's like an inheritance hierarchy of constructions. And some are quite idiomatic, and you have idioms in your language, kick the bucket in English, or all kinds of idioms that don't match up, that are isolates. You have other ones that are quite common patterns, and they have an inheritance hierarchy up to the top. And there is, in fact, a continuum of regularity from things that are quite idiomatic and different and don't connect up with any other constructions, and things that are quite regular and quite deep patterns and regular patterns, and they connect up with a lot of other things. And many people have argued recently, I would recommend highly the book by Cullicover on syntactic nuts. And he has argued that there is this continuum between idiomatic things and core grammar. And it's not, here's core grammar and here's idiomatic things, but there are all kinds of constructions in language that are partially idiomatic and partially core, partially regular, partially idiomatic, and it's very difficult to account for those with just like sort of core grammar. Okay, and I think we don't want, as you all know if you've read anything of mine, an innate universal grammar, but I'm going to adopt teaming modularity. Why not? So I think actually a big monolithic innate universal grammar is not consistent with teaming modularity. I think teaming modularity would rather have lots of smaller things that have evolved, like the ability to use symbols, something like predicate argument structure. I would actually prefer to call that event structure, but I'm calling predicate argument structure or something. Social intentions or speech act goals, the ability to certain speech and phonological abilities, categorization, and so forth and so on. Those are all abilities that humans have that are biologically based for sure, and were recruited as language evolved into the ability to process, use, and acquire a natural language. And this idea of a big monolithic grammar as a universal grammar as one big innate package seems to me extremely implausible. So I've never had any problems with biological bases to languages, this idea of universal grammar specifically. And I will say that the idea of universal grammar seems to be going the way of phlogiston and ether at this point, as Chomsky sort of starts bailing out and saying the only thing there is recursion, where other people say other things. And for me now, when I have a discussion with a generative grammarian, my conversation stopper is, so tell me exactly what's in universal grammar. I get out my pencil and I'm ready to write now. Tell me exactly what's in universal grammar. Okay, I'd like to know what, okay, noun phrases, yes, no. Adjacency constraint, yes, no. Recursion, yes, no. What's in there? And after almost a half a century, I would say we have less of an idea of what's in universal grammar now than we did before. I don't think we have anything. And if anybody has any ideas, I'd like to hear them. But they have to be specific. You can't say, well, you need constraints and all that sort of thing. You have to tell me exactly what's in there. Okay, and I would just think that, of course, it's a research program, but I would think we should have been making progress over 40 or 50 years rather than going backwards, which is what we seem to be. Okay. Okay, sorry, that's enough on that. Sorry. So that's where I'm coming from. And again, I have absolutely no problem with innate bases of language and language acquisition. The question is, what are the biological precursors? And I think there are going to be a variety of things having to do with communication and categorization and all kinds and symbols and things like that. And if you press me, I'll list some. I'll list some of them. I listed a few of them here, and then they get recruited into this new function in across evolution. But again, a universal grammar. It turns out, last point here. I'm in an institute with a linguistics, a typology department, and you talk to those people and you ask them what's universal in language, and you'll get almost nothing out of them. Because it turns out that things like you know, all the parts of speech, you know, prepositions, adverbs, and all that, none of them are universal with the possible exception of nouns and verbs, according to the typologists that I talk to. Subject and object are not universal according to the people I talk to. You have languages like Ashanese and Hakeltek that work with just something like Asian or actor or something like that. You have split ergative languages where some of the constructions have ergative structuring and some of them have nominative accusative structuring. So there are universals in language, and so but those are universals that are due to universals of human cognition. People all over the world cognize the world in similar ways. We think about events in the same way. All kinds of processes of attention. So we need things like topic and focus because of the way our attention works. And again, things like categorization and whatnot. So also the way that vocal auditory processing works. All human beings all over the world share the way of cognizing the world, the certain needs for communication, way of processing vocal auditory information, and those are the things that structure the universals. So yes, there are innate bases in language. Yes, there are universals, but no, not a universal grammar with content like the subjacency constraint and the projection principle and empty categories and so on and so forth. Okay, that's my approach. Okay, so let's now talk about specifically trying to move from the framework that I've set up over the last 3 days and into language. So what I want to claim to you is that the basic infrastructure, communicative infrastructure of pointing in language or pointing in other gestures in language is basically the same. And I actually think it's probably not very controversial. It's just that people don't usually lay it out like this. But what I've been calling the joint intentional frame or common ground that gives pointing its communicative significance, you've been over that more than, probably more than you'd ever like, is basically what many functional type linguists call the speech situation or the context of use or the pragmatics of the situation or whatever it might be. And I would just claim to you that prelinguistic communication of children and probably gestural communication prior to language evolutionarily had this kind of structure of a shared space, a shared communicative space before things started. And so when children start into language, that doesn't all of a sudden change. It's the same thing there all the time. The assumption of helpfulness, I think, of course, is the same in both. I guess that would be sort of Gricean cooperative principle, but I'm calling it the assumption of helpfulness. The social intentions or speech act goals are basically the same. I want to inform you of something, to ask your help or request something from you. I want to express something to you. Ultimately, I might want to ask you questions and whatnot, and those are all going to be the same. There may be some new ones I put here, so asking questions, you may or may not need language for that. Making promises, you may or may not need language for that. So there may be some new ones you can only do in language, but the basic ones that children start with, and that I assume human beings started with early evolution, are going to be the same. The basic things you want to get done in communicating by pointing and in communicating with language. There may be additional ones in language, but the basic ones are going to be the same. And the communicative intention, the way it works, is the same. In fact, I stole the idea from Dan, so the way the communicative intentions work in pointing, and he's using it mainly for language, so the basic way that the claim of attention, the Gricean structure of communication works, is going to be the same. And so now we're down only so those were the layers, the social intention and the communicative intention, those were the layers, and the referential intention is the sort of only thing left. And so, again, it's in some ways trivial and obvious, I would say, but I'm trying to be systematic and make it clear. And in the referential intentions, if you'll recall in the last sessions, we talked about both me trying to get you to attend to a referent and expressing my motive. So when somebody's asking me if I'm in line for the bathroom, they point and they do a quizzical thing. So the motive is, the expression of motive is some kind of facial expression or emotional expression, and this indicates the referent. And of course we know that language makes that split as well and expresses motives in various ways. So you can do it with your intonation, your facial expression. And what makes things so complicated in language, of course, is that we also have linguistic symbols for these things. So we have various speech act verbs, and we have all kinds of, ultimately, things that I think you can't really do in pointing, things like modal and epistemic operators. You could maybe theoretically do them there, but they really aren't there. So all kinds of things of your expression, of your motive, expression of your attitude. And again, things like modals and epistemics, I think, are probably be very hard to do in something other than language. But in pointing, they're all in my emotional expression, and this gets the referent, and in language, I do some of it with my emotional expression in my face, and I do some of it already encoded in the language. But then reference. Now obviously that's where all the difference is. That's where the major difference is how we direct people's attention referentially in language. So again, I understand it's almost trivial, but I'm just trying to emphasize all the rest of it is basically the same, although language takes it further. And what's different is simply the way we direct attention. And with language, we direct attention with conventions. Right? And pointing, you may or may not think it's conventional, we're not sure about that, but we have a whole set of conventions for doing this. They have a whole history, they have a whole long history and whatnot, and that is going to lead to some very different properties, obviously. I'll just start by just mentioning what's obvious, the indeterminacy of reference, that indeed when we refer using language, Gavagai, as we all know, needs some kind of context. I've used it in the context of language acquisition before. I've talked about, if a rabbit runs past and you say Gavagai, I really don't have any idea, but the situation that would be like language acquisition with children would be, we've decided we need to go find your pet rabbit that escaped, and then I point to it and I say, Gavagai, or we need some fur because we're making a fur coat, and I point to the rabbit. And it doesn't tell you exactly what it means, but it constrains it way down. If we have a shared activity with a shared goal, with shared attention, we really start to narrow down into, we're not going to get undetached rabbit parts if we're hunting for fur to make a fur coat. So the context and the shared activity is going to play a similar role in linguistic reference as it does in reference via gestures and pointing. I notice I did specify definite reference because I think indefinite reference has another set of things, and I'm going to actually come back to that slightly later. Then where you get the really big difference, what language does that you don't get in something like pointing and gestures is paradigmatic contrast, paradigmatic choices, and syntagmatic combinations. So paradigmatic choices just means for the same item, I can construe it in a zillion different ways because I have all these choices. So I can call it a dog or an animal or a pet or a pest. I can call the same thing by lots of different names because I have these paradigmatic choices within a slot in an utterance. I can say there's a, and then I can fill that in with lots of choices of things I can put in there. Almost infinite. And in addition, of course, my utterance is divided up into these syntagmatic combinations. So you can see it very readily in child language acquisition. The child goes from saying something like juice, and then they say, I want juice, and then they say, I want some juice, and then they say, I want some juice please, and then they say, I want some juice in my glass. And it's the same basic communicative intention, communicative act. They want the same thing in both cases, but they're now articulating out the communicative intention or communicative act into component parts in the conventional way that it's done in their language, which basically breaks up whole utterance level communicative intentions into these little bits that then are combined in these incredibly complicated ways. So it's the paradigmatic choice and the syntagmatic combination, the possibility of syntagmatic combination, that I think is where all the generative power of language comes in being able to express all these different meanings that can't get expressed in something like pointing. And of course, I say that in the background, meaning that the conventionalization process whereby humans conventionalize these symbols for various things. Of course, the language you have at any given moment in history has this whole history of people conventionalizing. I mean, why do we have all these different words for the same thing? Because people are pretty much the same thing. Because people have conventionalized them for different, slightly different purposes in different contexts, and they accumulate in the language. And by the time you get to it, by the time you're a child learning it, there's all this accumulation of conventions that have happened over all the period of time, and as long as they're somewhat useful, then they're still in the language. And there they all are, and you don't know anything about the history, you're just there to learn them. All right, so how might this conventionalization process have arisen? If you take most people, starting with David Lewis, and I like many aspects of Ruth Milliken's account of conventions as well, conventions are for certain going to need some kind of replication by imitation or something like that. They're socially transmitted, and Ruth Millikan is quite clear that if we just happen to be doing the same thing, if you and I both open a water bottle a certain way, it's just driven by the physics of the water bottle, then that's not a convention. But if I open it like this in some special way to illustrate my membership in the academic community, and you're going to do the same thing to illustrate your membership in the academic community, and you're doing it because I did it that way, or because other academics do it that way, then it's a convention that's passed on socially. So where might that have come from? Well, obviously, you've got to have pretty good skills of imitation. That's a prerequisite, or something like imitation. And as you know, I didn't argue at length, but mentioned in the first lecture, chimpanzees are not very good at imitation. They're not very good candidates for having conventional things. They may do a little more imitation than I thought 5 years ago, but they're still, you compare them to children, and they're not even in the same category. So, imitation is going to be obviously a big part of the picture. So let's think about, in evolution, something like hollow phrases. So let's think that language might have started with people wanting to do things, having a communicative intention, and having a symbol for it. Now, we have no idea how this started. It's a little bit difficult to imagine that the first thing that we want to call language was a infinitival complement with a relative clause. I mean, it's a little bit hard to think that's how things would have started. You would think, and with children, of course, children start with one symbol for one whole meaning, like juice meaning I want juice, or birdie meaning there's a bird, or whatever it might be. So let's just then assume as a sort of a reasonable assumption, I would think, that the earliest language would be symbols standing for whole complex things that later, either in history or evolution, or later in acquisition, if you're talking about the child, are going to actually be articulated with more complex structure of symbols, but at the beginning it's just going to be one. So if you have reference in the here and now, reference in the here and now, pointing does quite a good job, as we talked about. And it can even do a little bit of absent reference, but it does a pretty good job in the here and now. And one can imagine that these might have evolved as we started getting conventional things, that these might have evolved with the addition of vocal conventions into something like modern day demonstratives. My former postdoc, Holger Diesel, has a dissertation on demonstratives that I recommend to you highly, and basically he finds demonstratives and deictics in all the languages of the world. They seem to have no roots in nouns and verbs like many other grammatical items, quote unquote, because he doesn't think they're really grammatical items, but they don't have roots in other things. They don't seem to be grammaticalized from other kinds of words. And they all have, demonstratives either have two, so this and that, they have things that are close and far, and sometimes there are three markers, this, and in the middle and there, or that, or here and there. And so they're very spatially infused. That's what the meaning of a deictic is in some sense. And you quite often get pointing with deictics, okay? And that's there, or that, or this. And if you go back to Carl Buehler emphasizes that the major cut in types of linguistic items are between demonstratives and deictics, which work in the current space, and then all other content words. So not lexical items and grammatical items, but from a functional point of view, demonstratives, which rely on the current space around us, and content words, which do not in the same way. When you get reference that are not in the here and now, then that pointing is, I mentioned before that pointing can do a lot with absent reference, more than we thought, but it can't do that much. And absent reference is clearly one of the, it seems to me, driving forces of going beyond pointing. And we get these characterizing gestures, and I mentioned to you last time, I think the two functions of characterizing gestures, if you look at them in people using them, and people don't use them that much in everyday life. I've looked for it, and I've looked for it in children and adults, and I think one of the reasons is because language preempts them, and you don't get much of it. But I have seen people, I have a few examples in my last week's handout, and I think one very simple one is there's a construction workers, and so one of the times they do them is because when you can't use language. So it's a construction workers, they're fairly far from one another, it's very loud, and the guy goes like this. You know, he's asking for a chainsaw, because this is what you do with the chainsaw. So he's asking the other guy for a chainsaw. So essentially what you're saying, this is like a characterizing gesture. The function is like a relative clause, as I mentioned yesterday. It's like, I want the thing, that goes like this. So I'm indicating an object, and I want you to bring me the thing, and I'm giving you the action that one does with the object. So I'm indicating the object by a characteristic action. And the other function that they have, and so that's kind of noun-like, because I want a thing, and I'm identifying the thing with a characteristic action that it engages in, or this characteristic thing that I do with it. So you can ask for a hammer like this. And then there are the other major function that I've observed in people using characterizing gestures is when I tell you, turn it like this, turn it like that, okay? Do it like this. So instead of asking for a thing, I'm telling you what to do. And that, of course, is an action-like thing or a verb-like thing, and it relies on imitation. I'm telling you, I'm demonstrating for you what you should do, and you're supposed to imitate me. So I'm going like this, and you're supposed to turn the crank like this. So I think the characterizing gestures, if you look at their two functions, you can get a noun-like function, and you can get a verb-like function in the sense of indicating things by the actions associated or indicating the action itself. Right? So then you get this highly speculative little thing here in the middle of the second page, page 20, of going all the way from 8 attention getters to what we talked about the last 2 days, cooperative pointing. That is, attention getters are look at me, look at me. Cooperative pointing is I direct your attention around here this way triadically, but I'm still directing your attention just like I'm capturing it with an attention getter, but I'm directing it triadically. And then demonstratives are conventionalized ways of directing your attention in the immediate space around us. And then 8 intention movements are things where I'm getting ready to do this, and so I've abbreviated it. It's part of an action, part of a social interaction that we're normally in. The characterizing gesture is then something that's done to try to. It's a one step further removed because it's got the shared triadic kind of thing where the intention movement does not. And then finally we get from those to something like content words, nouns, and verbs, where we're going to get the conventionalized version of characterizing gestures ultimately in the conventions of the language. So then we've got this split between demonstrative and deictics on the one hand, and nouns and verbs as content words on the other. And I'm going to get to grammatical morphemes in just one second. Now, so others outside. So how now do they get to be real conventions? Because the other criterion of conventions, a la Lewis and Millikan, is that they have to be somewhat arbitrary, right? So the idea that, we can drive on the left side of the road or we can drive on the right side of the road, to use the well-worn example, and it doesn't matter which, but we all need to do it the same way. So the convention, the prototype of a convention is something that could have been done another way, and the reason it's done the way it is simply because everyone does it that way. And we could all switch and it would all be fine as long as we all did it the same way. So how do you get this arbitrariness into these characterizing gestures because they are obviously iconically related to the thing that I want you to get me or the thing that I want you to do? And I think, as I thought about it, I think one of the ways it probably is happens is that if you're an outsider, remember, now we've got to bring back in the joint attentional frame. If you're an outsider, you may not see the actual relation. So if you don't know what a chainsaw does, there may be some of you who you may not even know the English word chainsaw, but the chainsaws you think is, okay, so you may not know what it does or how you hold it. And so if you're observing me ask Dan to pass me the chainsaw, and you've never used one and you've never seen anybody use one, and then he hands me the chainsaw, then you go, oh, okay. So I guess when you want a chainsaw, you ask for it like that. So if you're a good imitator, then you just imitate me going like this, and you know that that stands for the chainsaw, even though you don't know the basis. You don't know the iconic basis for it at all. We can think of, I'm getting ready to go, we're going to go hunting. I'm thinking of, early humans. I'm getting ready to go hunting. The spear is usually hanging on the wall, and so I go to get it, and this gets conventionalized, but then my child watches me go like this. And so I go like this, and me and my compatriots go hunting. As soon as I go like this, like I'm going to grab the spear. My child doesn't know about grabbing spears. My child never went hunting with me, so they don't know this is the way you hold the spear. And they just think that when you're ready to go hunting, you go like this, and it's arbitrary. Okay? So one can imagine that if you're not in the joint attentional frame, if you're not privy to the convention as an iconic or characterizing expression, and you look at it from the outside, and you're a good imitator, so you can imitate somebody using something for a certain function, I would say it also presupposes that you have the communicative structure, but I'm already assuming that they can point. I'm already assuming they have this whole structure of social intentions, communicative intentions, and referential intentions that's already in place through pointing. So that stuff's already, the whole communicative structure is in place. Imitation comes in, and now once you've got imitation with it as well, I think you can get drift. And I put in here as another example is like money. So of this drift toward arbitrariness and conventionality. So if you've ever looked at the history of money, there are various accounts and various stages and all that. But one interesting stage that illustrates this point is if I borrowed 3 sheep from Dan and I'm going to pay him back with something else or whatever, the earliest things is I would draw 3 pictures of sheep, and he would keep in his pocket a picture of 3 sheep. That meant that I owed him 3 sheep. And then after a while, people decided, well, God, that's a lot of drawing, and that took me time to do it. I'm just going to put 3 marks down, okay? Or they put down 3 sheep heads first, and then, and then say, well, okay, I'll draw 1 sheep, and then I'll put 2 more marks, and that means 3 sheep. And there's this drift toward arbitrariness because the iconic element is not needed. And so I think here there's a different process going on because I think observing it from the outside is the real issue. But in any case, you can get a drift toward arbitrariness, and then at some point, as with money, there's this aha and says, hey, none of these things none of these things are like what they used to be anyway. So I have some new function. I'll just make up some completely new thing. So there's a kind of a generalization. So that now we get whatever electronic money and stuff because all you need to do is keep track of I'm going to give you my credit card, and we're going to take 10 marks out of 10 little digital things in my bank account in my bank, and add 10 little digital things to your thing in your bank account, and nobody ever gave anybody anything. So that generalization toward conventionalization, I think, could have happened early in language as well, toward arbitrariness. So, that would be my sort of account of how you could drift from more iconically based holophrastic, whole communicatives. I still want to stay, we're talking now about holophrastic things. One act for a complex communicative function, and you get a drift toward arbitrariness. Now we've got to get the grammar, and grammar, we're going to assume all of this infrastructure that I've already talked about. We're assuming the communicative infrastructure of the different levels of communication, communicative intentions. We're assuming now imitation and some conventions in hollow phrases. But now we have to get to grammar. And grammar, at its simplest level would be combining a couple of these things to create some new meaning. One presumes that's, I can't imagine too many other scenarios of that actually. And you could imagine, for example, in a single situation where there are multiple elements that are potentially relevant, and if I'm using a hollow phrase, I single out one of them. But if you don't understand, or if there's something further, then I single out another one, and 2 different intonation contours. And young children quite early will often do that. They'll say things like, eat. I have done it, eat. And then there's a pause, and berries, because you say eat, and I say, okay, you can eat, and what? And then you give me the next part. So the situation, the context, the communicative intention you intend to convey has multiple elements in it, but in a hollow phrase you lexicalize only one that you think is particularly informative or relevant, but then for various reasons you may need to put more in there. And one can imagine all kinds of automaticity of processing. Piaget talks about children doing 2 sensory motor schemes toward a goal, one, and then a pause, and then the next one, but then at some point, he calls them mental combinations. I look at the situation, and I do toot, toot, and I put them together, and then the act is a smooth combination of 2 sensory motor schemes toward a single goal combined together. So I don't think it requires a lot of complicated cognitive machinery to get us to what are called in early child language word combinations without any real syntax or grammar in the sense of marking of roles or anything like that, just combinations. Those seem to be, I can imagine that without any extra cognitive machinery, individuals using hollow phrases in the way that we've talked about could end up with combinations quite readily. But then, if we think about the prototype of what an utterance looks like, utterance semantics are prototypically events with participants, and I include under events states and everything else. So all the different all of Dowdy's 4 different types of categories, of actions and events. and the various participants, actors, agents, and patients, and however you want to talk about them. And so that's the sort of prototype. Now here's an interesting little tidbit that I also decided on. People ask me quite often, not quite often, but every so often, people ask me, do chimpanzees have event categories? So could they have something like events with participants or predicate argument structure or something like that? And I scratch my head and I think, you know, I'm not real sure how you answer that question. Chimpanzees certainly understand that this guy's going for the food, or this guy's trying to climb up to the top of the tree. So they understand the event in terms of intentional terms or maybe causal terms if it's an inanimate event. And they certainly, and it's very possible that they understand, that they recognize another one as an instance of something like it. I'm not sure they do that. I'm not sure if they do. But I can imagine that they could say there's another instance of somebody climbing a tree, and it's sort of similar to another one. I just don't know. That could make sense. But I think human event categories or events conceptualizations actually are different, and I think they come from imitation. That is to say, if you're doing an action and I imitate you, by definition of the way I'm conceptualizing it, I'm doing the same thing you're doing. I'm trying to do the same thing you're doing, but it's a different person doing it. So I've got the action is the same, but the participant is different. And I'm doing the same thing, but I'm doing it now to a bottle and now to a grass. And so I'm doing the same thing, but I'm doing it to something different. So when you get into imitation and the generalization of imitated actions onto other objects, which I could do just by generalization without imitation, I could generalize this to this object, for example, then I think you can get what are the kinds of event categories you need to have predicate argument structure, if that's what you want to call it, but where you have event categories with open slots for participants. And I think if you don't imitate, I think it's not inconceivable. There's no, of course, a chimp could see, one guy climbing a tree today and another guy climbing the same tree tomorrow. It's conceivable they can see that, and they can see that as the same thing with event structure. I mean, with a different participant, same event with a different participant. So you could do it from a third-person perspective, just watching. But imitation has something really grounded in it because I'm doing the same thing you're doing and it's a different slide. So I think that imitation probably made for, and of course the prototypical sentence or utterance in human language, of course, is an animate agent performing some action, either with or without something they're acting on. So I think that imitation also probably played a role in being able to, the basic underlying conceptualization of event participant structure that is the basis of subject predicate argument, whatever you want to call it. And then also, of course, the other prototypical type of utterance semantics is some kind of topic introduction, which would be like a demonstrative, all the kinds of various kinds of copulous sentences, there's a something, here's a something, that's, those kinds of introductions and various kinds of things of that nature. So, so once you get events with different participants, then you could say that the basic sort of structure of indicating both the event and one or more participants could be then structuring these word combinations. The utterance pragmatics is, of course, I sort of divide into speaker, utterance level pragmatics now is what I'm talking about, and into speaker motives and attitudes, what I think Talmy Gavone calls it the modal epistemic envelope within which you wrap your utterance. So those are basically speaker-oriented things that I'm letting you know my attitude toward the proposition or toward the event that I'm describing. And then the other side of it is more listener-based things. I'm structuring the information for your perspective, your knowledge, your expectations. So basically, referential choice for noun phrases and verb phrase. Do I use a pronoun or a full noun or a noun with a relative clause, and so forth. And topic focus for information structure. Do I stress this word or stress that word, or whatever it might be. And those are called by people like Janet Goodell, those are called referential, attention to referential newness in the case of referential choice of noun phrases and verb phrases, and relational newness in terms of topic focus structure of a whole utterance, and what gets topicalized and put in the background, and what gets focused and put in the foreground. Okay, so if I am a being who has all these communicative abilities, conventionalizing some kind of hollow phrase, event and participant structure as underlying conceptualization, and also introducing topics, the pragmatics of wanting to express my attitude and adjust for you. I know it's a lot, but language is complicated. I think now you've got the sort of building blocks where you can really talk about grammar full blown. So if grammar is not coming from an innate universal grammar, and is coming from these kinds of things that I've been talking about, which are basic cognitive abilities, conceptualization and imitation, and communicative intentions, basic cognitive abilities, and you're getting the sort of basics, then where does grammar come from? How does it arise out of these abilities? And the linguists, of course, all know this, but I find that in cognitive science in general, it's not a very well-known fact that when you talk about grammar in terms of particular things like grammatical morphemes and things, we know where they come from. They come historically from patterns of grammaticalization, and grammatical morphemes come almost exclusively from nouns and verbs and demonstratives of various kinds. So grammatical constructions, what constructions are, the kinds of constructions we have today in our language, what constructions are is basically prefabricated packages. Prefabricated is a term used, I don't know if there's a comparable term in French, but in English it's like prefab houses, or houses where this part is built and that part built and you just stick them together. So you got the components already built. So you have these prefab packages for recurrent communicative situations, including both the semantics and the pragmatics. So actually, let's skip down just a little bit to, I have an example of a car wreck. I have all these examples of various things. So these are some of the kinds of constructions you would get in English, for example. If you have an agent-focused question, an agent-focused informative statement, you get something like Mary hit Jerry. All right? A patient-focused, when you're just talking about informing somebody, you say something like he or Jerry got hit by Mary. That's a passive construction. So the passive is a pre-package that's ready for you to both make a statement and to focus on the patient. We get an agent question, who hit him? So now our speech act goal or our social intention is to ask a question, but we're focused on the agent, who hit him, and a patient question, who got hit. That would be a passive or a patient-focused question. There are other ways to say that, of course. Out on the right, I have things where you can vary around with the different, the noun phrase, choosing either a pronoun or a full noun or whatever, because I think those are kind of modularized. The noun phrase choice, the referential choice, is independent of the construction as a whole. You do that separately. Each referential choice is made on the basis of what the listener knows or doesn't know, what we've shared or haven't shared, independently of the rest of the construction. So the noun phrase choice is varying, and then we're focusing on the agent or patient, and I'm either informing you or asking a question. Clefs, which various versions of which are extremely prominent in French, but we say things like, it was Mary that hit him, and that's used in a situation where you think somebody else hit him, and you say Bill hit him, and I say no, it was Mary that hit him, and so I stress Mary. The patient cleft, it was Jerry who got hit. Agent cleft question, was it Mary that hit him? Patient cleft question, was it Jerry that got hit by her? So these constructions are prefabricated packages that incorporate both, not both, lots of different things, including semantics and include both semantics and pragmatics, and many dimensions of it at that. So both my speech act goal, typically within the verb phrase, my epistemic modal attitude with some kind of an epistemic marker or modal auxiliary or something like that, and then my speech act goals also my adjustment for your perspective. So me saying that Mary hit Bill or Bill got hit by Mary, focusing on the agent or patient, is typically done given where your attention is focused and what you know and what you don't know. So it includes both my goal, my adjustment for your perspective, as well as the basic semantics of what I want to, the event I actually want to talk about. So historically, what happens is these kinds of constructions arise and are grammaticalized for recurrent functions that happen over and over again. Now here's some examples beneath, and not all of these are historically attested in the way we would like to. So if there are any linguists among you who say, wait a minute, I don't think that's the way it happened, you may be correct, because the problem with grammaticalization, of course, is that spoken language is gone, and we have to infer grammaticalization processes either from written language or from comparing closely related languages. But here are some sort of plausible ones. They mostly come from Tomasello, and as people know, he tends to speculate, but nevertheless. You get things like a grammaticalization of complex constructions like he pulled the door and it opened, gets grammaticalized into he pulled the door open, and that's typically called a resultative construction. The go future is quite frequent in all the Romance languages and many other languages as well. I am going to see my bride means I am going, so I'm actually in the process of walking there. I'm going in order to see my bride. I'm going to London to see my bride. But then that gets grammaticalized into I'm going to see the next century, or I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do that, where it just means future. Infinitival complements. I want it, I buy it. I want to buy it. Right? So we have two different clauses. They get combined, grammaticalized by various processes of automation and whatnot into one construction. I believe that, where that is a demonstrative, and then I believe that Mary will wed John, or I believe Mary will wed John. My boyfriend, he rides horses, he bets on them. My boyfriend who rides horses bets on them, relative clause. Right? So many of these kinds of things, these examples may or may not be factually correct. But many examples like this have various kinds of documentation that what you get is you get what Tomasello calls loose discourse sequences in different clauses with pauses between them, and they get grammaticalized under one intonation contour with one speech act function, not one, but for one purpose. And if they're recurrent things that happen often enough in the speech community, then they get grammaticalized into these conventionalized patterns. The aphorisms down here at the bottom both come from Tomasello. Yesterday's discourse is today's syntax. So the discourse gets grammaticalized into the syntax. And similarly, yesterday's syntax, that is separate words, is today's morphology. And we know that morphological markers, the vast majority that we know about, are freestanding words that get, and in French is full of these clitizations and whatnot, where freestanding words get assimilated to words that are standing next to them. You get possessive markers coming from possessive pronouns and so forth and so on. Prepositions come mostly from relational nouns. Auxiliary verbs come from full verbs. All these little grammatical particles come from, almost all can be traced back to various kinds of nouns, to nouns and verbs of various kinds in various ways. And so the part that I skipped over back near the top of page 21 is what I call second-order symbols, and I call them that, and I've called them that in 1992, and to my knowledge, not a single other person has ever picked up on it, and so I may have no value whatsoever. But it seems to me that in addition to nouns and verbs as naming the events and participants that you want to talk about, what are often realized as grammatical morphemes, but sometimes as full words, like prepositions, for example. So we're talking in terms of function, not form. So second-order symbols are things that serve one of two functions, either relating reference to one another or designating the role of something in a whole utterance. So you get things like case markers or word order as a particular special kind of symbol, indicating the semantic role of something in the utterance. You get what Christian Layman calls external agreement, something like subject-verb agreement, which crosses different constituent boundaries. And so subject-verb agreement in French would be one example. Internal agreement, some things like determiner, adjective, nouns, the agreement in gender and number of determiner, adjective, and noun in French noun phrases would be another example. So internal agreement, external agreement, case marking, these are things where you have markers that tell you how to relate the items to one another, either the role they're playing or that these go together as constituents. Those are the sort of major functions. And then the second function is grounding reference, grounding nouns and verbs in the ongoing joint intentional frame. So Nouns are grounded in the ongoing joint intentional frame by determiners, possessives, relative clauses, and so forth and so on. So the internal structure of the noun phrase, a lot of the grammatical morphology there is about, in some sense, relating that contentful noun to the, so I'm talking about the chair, my chair, the chair sitting next to the wall, whatever. And verbs, tense, aspect, modality, kinds of things where I'm grounding the event relative to now. It's happening now, it happened a while ago, it's going to happen in the future, it may possibly happen in the future. When something was happening, something else happened, so all that kind of thing. Indefiniteness and non-finiteness cause all kinds of problems that I can't even begin to think about. But a lot of the complexities, and I know a lot of the things that you all work, that some of you work here on quantification and modal and things like that, those for the most part deal with indefinite and non-finite things, so we're not talking about grounding it in the current joint intentional frame, and now we're talking about these categories as more general, talking generically about cats rather than, or a cat rather than this one over here right now, so indefinite reference and non-finite verbs and whatnot, they cause all kinds of difficulties that I won't go into, but these kinds of things are the main things that I think that are happening when you have definite reference and finite verbs. Okay, just one other quick thing is that I think in terms of discourse, I think that really complicated tense aspect modality marking, lots of it, especially tense, may come from the needs that are generated in narratives, because when you try to think, where would you ever need, by next year, I will have been writing this book for a long time, or whatever, will have been. And so these kind of really complex, or while he was doing this, this happened. And so you set the deictic center, you set the reference point in different places, and then do another event with regard to that set point. I'm guessing that narratives is probably the context where you really need that kind of complicated stuff. And noun classes, like gender classes, which have always been thought to be sort of functionless, they're a case of pure form, things like masculine and feminine in French, and some languages have large numbers of noun classes. Bernard Comrie and others in his department like to say that the main function of those is really, again, for reference tracking in discourse, for being able to use a masculine pronoun gets you much better ability to anaphorically get back what it's referring to. If it's got masculine and feminine, you've cut down the possibilities by a lot, and if you don't have noun classes at all, it's harder to get back to it. So in any case, discourse was probably a big reason for noun classes as well as complex tense aspect modality marking. Okay, so I understand that that's highly speculative. I understand that I skimmed across the top of a lot of things, but what I was trying to do was give you an approach to the emergence of symbols in this joint intentional frame and the gradual conventionalization of things from people outside the frame, the drift toward arbitrariness and imitation inside the frame, and then the grammaticalization, where we have certain conceptual abilities, event conceptualization and so forth, and then these things get grammaticalized in discourse and prepackaged into constructions, and then that's the basis of modern day languages, this grammaticalization process of prepackaged constructions for various functions. So now, the last point is universals, and I'm just repeating what I said before, is if you were to buy something like this for the particular constructions of English or particular constructions of French or Ashanese or whatever it might be, that this is indeed how the particular constructions arise, then the question is there in addition a role for universal grammar? And I won't beat a dead horse here after I've been so much at the beginning, but I myself don't see what extra role you need for universal grammar, and I think you can get everything from these more general cognitive and processing abilities and the kinds of things I've talked about here. So let me then, I think because we started a little bit late, let me just, I think I need about 10 or 15 minutes, if everybody can bear with me about that much longer, please, to talk about acquisition, which is what a major part of my research is on acquisition, at least half, and in my career probably more than half, and so I'll do that in 10 minutes. That probably says something, but I'll leave it alone. The cultural dialectic is that in culture, it has to be created. It's created historically. So these grammatical constructions are created historically, and the pattern regularizes in the people who are the speakers of it. And this is a drawn-out historical process, and there may be in-between states. We have lots of things in our language today, by the way, that are halfway grammaticalized. English and modal auxiliaries being the classic example. And so there's this historical process. But children aren't creating it. They're just, quote-unquote, just learning it. So children are trying to do what adults do. Whatever the state of the language is at this moment, they're trying to master it. They're actually trying to communicate, but as a sub-goal to that, they're trying to master the conventions that they hear being used around them and use them in the same way that others use them. So they're not creating, they're learning, and they're doing their best to learn. These interact a lot, by the way. Just slight sidelight, but just the interaction between history and acquisition, it's quite well known that one of the things that happens is that when language, there's an inverse relationship between frequency and irregularity, or there's a relationship anyway, I don't know, in that the only things that are irregular are things that are highly frequent. And if you think about learning, if it's irregular, I've got to hear it a lot, like an irregular past tense or something like that. I have to hear it a lot in order to do it, because I can't do it from a pattern. I have to do it as an individual item, so I have to hear it a lot. And what happens in languages is that something that's irregular gets less frequent, then children start to regularize it. Right? And we have lots of verbs in English, the famous English past tense. We have all kinds of verbs that at one time were irregular past tenses and are getting regularized over historical time because the frequency of those items are going down, and so children tend to regularize them. So you get, so what's the past tense of the verb slide? Slide, slided, slid, slud. Okay. Right. And we have lots of those verbs in English, and it's essentially a function of frequency. If you've heard the irregular quite bring and brought, if you've heard that a lot, bring and brought is no problem. The young children quite often will say bringed, and they say bringed because presumably they haven't heard brought quite enough yet. So children tend to regularize because they want to find patterns. Right? And frequency in the historical thing. So there's an interaction between acquisition and the historical process as the language changes across time. So children start with something with hollow phrases. Children start with they don't have to match adult single words. They can be phrases, but the child conceives of them as single items. And for single functions, I have all kinds of things here: naming objects, requesting or indicating events, asking questions like what's that or where go, and I'm assuming that what's that is one word for them, one item for them. So they start with these single word things, just like I was proposing that maybe we did evolutionarily. Then there's some kind of imitative learning, cultural imitative learning of the hollow phrase. The child learns that this form is used for this function. When you want to find something, you say, where's the X, or you say, where is it, and mom finds it for you, and so forth. Now, again, the primacy of the utterance is important, because when people talk about word learning, and this is where I spent a large part of my early research career, was studying word learning, and people tend to conceptualize it like word learning in a classroom, where I name something and I say Dax, and you're supposed to just, I'm just naming it for you. But it turns out that's not how children hear most of their words. In some cultures, nobody stops and names things for children. And in our culture, we don't stop and say, look, giving, or look, of, or, or look. So you don't name things that aren't concrete objects. And in some cultures, they don't name them at all. So you've got to learn it in the ongoing flow of discourse. And you're hearing whole utterances. You only hear whole utterances. Even if it's a one-word utterance, you only hear utterances. And so the child has got to extract the word out of the utterance. They don't get them singly packaged by themselves. You've got to extract it out of the utterance. And so what you have to do, what I claim you have to do, is you have to comprehend the overall communicative act. Mom wants me to go pick up that toy. And now she says, go pick up the Dax. And I somehow know that go pick up the, one way or another, I know that go pick up the means to go over there and get this. And so the Dax must mean that thing over there. So I've got to do what I call a blame assignment in the utterance. That is, it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be like the adult. But I've got to chop up the whole utterance and say what functions are being served by the different pieces of this utterance. And to do that, I have to understand the overall communicative intention at some point. So if mom says, go pick up the Dax, and I don't process anything. So the fact that she's pointing and looking doesn't mean anything to me somehow, and I don't know what she wants at all. Then I think it's fairly obvious, but then I can't parse the sentence. I can't parse the sentence if I don't know something about the overall meaning. It doesn't have to be precise, but I have to know something about it, and then I have to say, in this overall meaning, this form, this linguistic form is doing this part of it, and this form is doing that part of it, and that's what I've got to do to extract a word out of the utterance. And this is not emphasized very much in word learning. Most word learning studies, they'll say something like the child, like, this is a dax, and they assume that this is a, they don't even think about the this is a, because this is a is used to introduce new reference and whatnot, and you assume the child knows it and stuff. But this is a, or here's a, or there's the, are also parts of an utterance. They're topic introducing, or whatever, you know, various things, they're sort of various related functions, existentials and things. And what the child has to do to learn this is a dax is he has to know something about what this is doing, and he has to know something that dax is the indicating object. So they've got to do some kind of blame assignment to extract the word out of the entire utterance. And a couple of things that help them with that. One is, of course, the syntagmatics. Needless to say, if I know every word in the sentence, if I know go get the, and I know those words, and I see here go get the dax, well then I know the dax is the part left over, because I know what go get the is, and I know that she wants me to go pick up that thing over there, so I know that go get the, and I know that dax must be the thing over there that she wants me to go get. So if you know the other words in the sentence, so this is one of the reasons why word learning takes off as children get older, is because as they know more language, it's easier to do the blame assignment thing in every utterance they hear, because because large parts of it are already identified, and so then the unidentified part is easier to pick out. The second thing that helps is known alternatives, the paradigmatics, and I guess I won't go into that, but basically knowing what the alternatives are in helping to learn the meaning of a word. So if mom says, if the first animal you ever see in your life is a moose, and mom says moose, you might think it's all mammals or something, but if you know dog, cat, deer, cow, etc., then moose is going to be this special animal in contrast to the other ones. So various principles of contrast, going all the way back to Saussure, but various principles of contrast also help you figure out the meaning. By knowing what the alternatives are, you know what the range of reference that one is can refer to. So if we're talking about utterance as being primary, learning words is extracting bits out of utterances by knowing the full communicative intention and doing some kind of blame assignment process. Abstracting constructional patterns then is, again, taking the whole utterance and then abstracting from that utterance and finding patterns across similar utterances. So after you get to hollow phrases in children's early language acquisition, you get to what I've called verb islands, and other item-based constructions. So children's earliest in English, at least, and I think this pattern generalizes to other languages that are typologically quite different as well, if you make the right adjustments, is the earliest things you would want to call constructions with any abstractness at all, that is, that are not just hollow phrases or things that are concrete pieces of language, but things that have slots in them or have some abstraction, are what I've called verb islands or other item-based constructions. So you get things in English like the child says, where's the dog, where's the cat, where's the juice, where's the X? So part of the construction is concrete. It's a specific set of words. That's why they're called islands. So it's a specific set of words, and then there's one slot in there that's abstract. So you hear, where's the X, where's the Y, where's the Z, and you get a slot in that variable position. Martin Brain called these pivot constructions back in the 1960s, and verb islands are essentially pivot constructions with a few twists. And what children learn early on, and this was my verb island claim, and the claim that's gotten me in the most trouble of any of my various claims, is that children's early language is not a grammar at all. There are no abstract categories cutting across different constructions. There are only local, item-based abstractions, like where's the X, where's the Y, where's the Z. It gets you where's the something, and then they learn kick the X, Y, Z, and then they learn give me the X, Y, Z, or they learn so-and-so, smile, and each of those little islands is the child is learning how to talk about that event. Here's the way you talk about that event. Okay? And they are not related at all. There's no generalization across them. So there's not a grammar, there's not abstract categories that cut across constructions, there's only ways of talking about events isolated from one another as constructional islands. And that's the first step. And then they're going to start making the abstractions across these things later, and that's when we're going to get to complex grammar, and that's going to be age 2.5 to 3. Much later, Cindy Fisher and people like that now are claiming that it's earlier, and that's part of the battleground right now. But in any case, it partly depends on methods, whether you use preferential looking or other kinds of methods, and I won't go down too far down that path. But basically, these early kind of verb island and pivot kind of constructions, initially, I would say they have no grammar to them in the sense that they're just word combinations with an abstract slot, but at some point they will get markings that tell you what the functions of them are, either word order or a case marking in a case marking language like German or whatever. They will start getting markings that indicate the role that the item is playing in the construction. And we have lots and lots of studies that I think are convincing that children, if you teach them a new verb and you give them some weird kind of syntax with it, it doesn't bother them at all. They learn the new syntax for that verb, and they don't generalize it to anything they have. When children get older and you teach them a kind of a weird word order in English or some weird syntax, they correct it and they assimilate it to the canonical form because they're older and they have more abstract constructions now. And so they assimilate what you have said in this weird way into the canonical way that they know to be conventional English or French. And at a younger age, they don't, because they don't have those abstract constructions yet. They have item-based, concrete kinds of constructions. And so the abstract constructions build up gradually on the basis of, I talked about not counting imitation. So imitation is clearly, the way you learn linguistic content is through some form of cultural learning or imitation. That goes without saying. And then the other three processes I've talked about are analogy, which is a well-respected, long recognized process in historical linguistics, analogy across different items that have the same pattern. Children form analogies at an early age. Dedra Gintner has studied that quite a bit, and you have the same relational structure but with different content. So, and you form analogies. And you get syntagmatic categories like agent and patient, and also subject and object. I won't get into the differences between those, but you get those from analogy across different constructions. And you get paradigmatic categories like noun and verb from distributional analysis of the type done by connectionist networks. Connectionist networks aren't going to be able to acquire language the way children do because at the moment, because they only work on distribution and they don't work on analogy. And they don't work on analogy because to do syntactic analogies, not morphological analyses based on sound, but to do syntactic analyses where the sound isn't an issue, you have to know the function of things to draw the analogy. And until the connectionist nets get some function, they won't be doing it like children do it. They may get a very long way with distributional analysis, and in fact they do get a very long way with distribution analysis, but they won't get there without some kind of analogy in my view. And then finally, the processes of entrenchment and preemption are the processes by which children don't overgeneralize. And that's been one of the basic issues that has been one of the basic criticisms of this approach from more formal-oriented acquisition people is that, well, okay, you've got this bottom-up generalization process, but when does it, how does the child know when to stop? Why don't they overgeneralize more often? And the two processes are entrenchment and preemption. I can illustrate entrenchment with a party trick, and the party trick usually works pretty well, especially with non-native speakers. So which sounds worse to you? He disappeared it or he vanished it? Which sounds worse? They're both wrong, by the way, in case you're wondering. They're both non-grammatical. He disappeared it or he vanished it? Which sounds worse? The first. He disappeared it sounds worse to most people. And the hypothesis is, and we have a study of this with young children, is because you've probably heard, as a non-native speaker, you've probably heard disappeared hundreds or thousands of times, and you've probably only heard vanished a dozen times or something. It's much less frequent. So the principle of entrenchment is the more you hear something a certain way, you've heard disappeared as an intransitive verb many, 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 many times, so you know it's not a transitive verb. And preemption is, in places where you might have expected to hear disappear as a transitive, you would have heard he made it disappear. So in English, the way you make disappear into a transitive, so you can't say Mike disappeared the bottle, but you can say Mike made the bottle disappear, and that keeps it intransitive. So you've both heard he disappeared it as an intransitive quite a lot, and it's the tendency to want to make it a transitive is preempted by this periphrastic causative construction, he made it disappear. So, so these the two processes of preemption, of entrenchment and preemption, also are what we call usage-based processes that keep the generalizations from overdoing it. And all of this is summarized in my 2003 book called Constructing a Language, and these processes, the ones that are in bold here on page 23, analogy, distribution analysis, entrenchment and preemption, and imitative learning as the basic way of learning content, are all outlined and proposed to be sufficient for language acquisition, given all this other stuff I've been talking about, given the conceptual structure of events and participants, and given understanding communicative intentions, and given all of that stuff. And so given the basic ability to use linguistic symbols in communicatively meaningful ways, the acquisition of the grammatical patterns in particular, these processes are sufficient, and you don't need anything else in addition. Okay, so let's now then finish here with just the last summary. I have in figure 2, I have, the figure 2 is missing because of the way the Xeroxing didn't give it to you, but it's supposed to have the dark gray in the same way that the original, the one from day 1 or day 2 or whatever had on it here. So this is the joint intentional frame or common ground, just as you have in pointing. And I've just sort of drawn out that, again, the utterance goes from me to you, and from your understanding my communicative intentions, and we've got a referential situation with events and participants, and I'm encoding my goals and attitude with my social intention, my modal epistemic stance. I'm adjusting for your perspective in terms of referential choice, referential newness, and information structure in terms of relational newness. And this doesn't have any depth to it, I understand, but I'm just trying to lay out the similarities to the pointing, so you can have basically very similar situation to the diagram we need to draw for pointing, but adding in all this extra stuff that we've talked about today that comes from, well, ultimately from general cognitive processes, from teaming modularity, where we have these little pieces that are all coalesced into language somewhere in our evolution. So the same basic social cognitive, social motivational infrastructure as pointing and gestures that would have had before language in evolution, and that it has before language in children in ontogeny. That structure is there first, and this new way to make reference and to direct attention then gets laid on top of all of that. That's the take-home message from today, is all the stuff I've been talking about for 3 days is this infrastructure, and this new, and it's the same infrastructure as language, but this new way to refer to things, and these constructions are these really complicated ways of packaging everything from all this into one thing. My speech act goal, my adjustments for you, what I want to say, my epistemic modal stance, all of that is in one pre-package, and then there are these modular bits in noun phrases and verb phrases and stuff that also are being done at the same time. One thing I did, one thing I forgot to say, so I'm sorry, I'm going to just backtrack real quick one time. Some of the things that people think you need universal grammar for are these complicated, basically transformational kinds of things, like extraction constraints. And I'm just going to refer you to Adele Goldberg's new book called Constructions at Work. And she has chapter 7, I believe it is, and Van Valen has worked on this as well, to look at extraction constraints as basically, and other things like that, as basically a problem of, and I mentioned this from the handout, but I didn't mention it orally, of basically a problem of merging, or maybe I should use the word merging, maybe I should use the word unification of different constructions whose specifications may not be in line with one another. So things like you can't extract a noun phrase out of a relative clause because the relative clause is presupposed information, a restrictive relative clause. The noun phrase is presupposed information assumed to be shared, and if you put it in a question, you can't put the question word on it because the question word is presumably about something that we don't share and that's new, so that's a new question rather. So that's way too simple. But the basic idea is that information structure, the focus domain of the sentence in terms of information structure, can be incompatible between two constructions that you need to put together, like a sentence with a relative clause into a question, a WH question, for example. So I don't pretend to be an expert enough to deal with that, and if you ask me any hard questions on that, I'm going to be embarrassed. But I'll just keep saying Adele Goldberg, 2006, Chapter 7, please. So then the summary of the symbols drifted toward the arbitrary in terms of conventions. You need imitation for that. And in terms of the grammar, the historical grammaticalization of constructions and an ontogeny, you find the patterns and generalize. And I have to use the word here, normative, which I didn't bring up again, but let me just say then that again, to say what I said before. Historically, we're grammaticalizing these patterns. If you look on the edge of the language, if you look in spoken discourse, you'll see all kinds of funny things that are kind of sort of grammatical, sort of not, like resumptive pronouns in the middle of relative clauses and things like that. You get all kinds of funny things that are semi-grammatical when you look at spoken speech and spoken discourse. But at some point they become more regularized and conventional, at least some of them will. And then the child hears them and learns that pattern. And I have down here the word normative. Recall back to our little child here saying, 9, nicht, 9. Okay? I think the same kind of normativity that you get when children are seeing you do things and they learn, this is the way you use scissors. You do it like this. Here's the appropriate way to use scissors. Here's the way one uses scissors. Okay? I think that normativity is the same exact normativity that goes with, this is the way you say this. And when you say it funny, it doesn't sound right. It doesn't mean, somebody's going to come shoot you. You didn't break a rule and you're going to go to jail. All right? So it's a normativity that this is the way one says things in our group. And so the normativity is basically of the same type, and grammaticality judgments are normativity judgments. And we know that on the edge of things, all you have to do is pick up any issue of linguistic inquiry, and you know that there are things where there are borderline judgments about whether it's grammatical or not for various reasons. And so I think the patterns that are well established and frequent sound to us normative, and we cringe when they're broken, and the ones that are on the fringe have not become normative in that same way. But based on our research that we just started on normativity, all children have to do is actually observe adults doing something enough, and they automatically give it a normative structure. So the final sort of formula is that ontogeny. I just want to return to evolution. Evolution, there, one of the large-scale theories, Boyd and Richardson talk quite a bit about it, is dual inheritance theory, and humans are a very prototype example of dual inheritance. That is, we inherit both our genes and all the things they code for. We inherit all of that, but we also inherit a culture. We also inherit, in a different way, of course, but we inherit the culture in the sense that we're born into people doing things, and in the case of language, that means we're born into people using utterances in certain ways, and with certain conventions behind them, exemplifying certain patterns. And so we've inherited both our body and our brain and our ability to do things, but we've also inherited a social cultural world that we're born into, and the process of language acquisition and language history is then somehow bringing all that together. So that's it. It doesn't matter. Okay, so, questions, comments? Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Is the model powerful enough to account for cases which seem to be accounted better by the postulation of the UG or some kind of principle kind of structure, like the invention or acquisition of Creole languages out of regions in which you don't have a distributional phenomena which could be used by the learner in order to.
Can you repeat the question?
He's asking about the emergence of Creole languages, Pidgins and Creoles, basically. And I think those are situations that really haven't been studied well enough, because most of them happened in the past and we haven't really seen the process. I understand their Nicaraguan Sign Language might be some kind of exception in this new language, Bedouin, whatever it is. But basically, children growing up in one of those situations, a pigeon situation, for example, if you start there, their parents have a native language. And they're hearing a lot of their parents' native language, as well as the pigeon. And quite often the pigeons are used in the work setting and whatnot, and at home they would be using the native language. And then, so I don't know how you get from there, the Creole then, and children are regularizing, that's for sure. And in things like the Nicaraguan Sign Language, we know that the kids who come into it at a younger age are regularizing things and making things normative that the older kids who started at an older age were not doing. So I think, you know, what you're seeing in those cases is that, again, just like I can tell you, if I see two people ski down a slope, I can tell you who learned when they were 15 and who learned when they were 5. See, these younger children, for whatever reason it is, acquiring language at this younger age, they're regularizing things and normativizing things that, and maybe grammaticalizing things that the older kids didn't. So I would say in the case of naturally arising pigeons and creoles, you have to look at actually the input to the language acquisition device, and there are native languages around in the pigeon and in creole situations. There's quite often a lot, I assume, I'm not an expert, but I assume there's a lot of bilingual and native language and creole together and all that kind of thing. So yeah, so I don't think you need any new principles for that, in my opinion. Yeah.
When the child hears her mama say something and pointing to a toy, for example, and she understands, Mama wants me to pick up a toy.
Yeah.
Well, you're supposing that her language of thought is quite rich. I mean, how rich are you obliged to suppose?
This is the hard part, is that it's very difficult for us to conceptualize a complex situation that's not fully differentiated, that's somehow undifferentiated. So let's take a 12-month-old baby who knows no language.